the Detroit Lions rebuild, I shouldn't say great, but encouraging and good.
Yeah.
Week 1 last week, they lose a close one, 38-35 to the Eagles in a fashion that I think has been pretty symbolic of the Lions under Dan Campbell. Like, no matter who the opponent, they just seem to always be in the game. They grind, they fight, they battle, they claw. A lot of it, I think, was at first kind of like hokey and jokey and, the proverbial team that plays for like the tough-minded coach. And Dan Campbell's out there talking about biting kneecaps and they're a good story. And it was like, oh, look how much they battle. But it's a real piece. Like the Lions, even if they're going to lose and they're outgunned, they are going to fight you until like their last breath. They make me think of the you probably never seen them, but Monty Python, for anybody who the chat knows. And there's like the skit where the two knights are battling and the one knight gets both of his arms cut off and he's like, no, it's a flesh wound, it's fine, like I'll keep fighting. The other knight's like, both of your arms are gone, you can't do anything. And so he cuts off both his legs. He's like, I'll bite your legs off. He's like, you can't do anything, you have no arms and no legs, like this is done. That's the Lions. Like no matter what, they're going out, not in a comedic scenario, they're going out fighting no matter what. And today, maybe Washington isn't the ideal team to be able to plant your flag and be like, boom, we've arrived, we beat this team. I guess it depends on what you view, Washington as, but a tough performance against the Eagles last week that was symbolic of how they played last year, especially down the stretch. They get a win today against Washington when Washington was coming back a little bit and Detroit just kept making plays. But the thing we want to hone in on is this rebuild for Detroit that is really focused on the trenches, the offensive line and the defensive line and what they've done. Jared Goff, in theory, is not their quarterback of the future. But what's nice for what they've done is by building through the trenches, the Lions have the making of a competitive team now, but then also one that could be set up for success in the future when they have their quarterback of the future, whether it's a free agent or they draft somebody. It feels like teams often get ahead of themselves in their rebuilds. You get the quarterback and then you just load up on weapons, but then there's no protection. Or you load up on offense and you have a horrible defense and your QB gets their hand forced in games and you're constantly playing from behind. Or you're playing in bad games.
Or the Cardinals.
Rough. Like, they have talented quarterbacks and they have talented pieces, but then they're surrounded by nothing. And it changes that team's development path, and especially that quarterback's development path. Whereas the Lions, it seems like they're really building a holistic team first that started from the trenches and it's worked its way out. So that way, seemingly, and again, in theory, once they plug the quarterback in, though they have those supporting pieces already in place, which again, having that team-minded approach now makes them competitive now and then also sets them up for success in the future. They've got some really sexy, weapon pieces. DeAndre Swift, amon-ra St. Brown, which is looking like the greatest draft pick in the history of the
Literally
NFL.
The next coming.
Maybe already arrived. I think it's pretty.
Yeah.
I think you can say right now that amon-ra St. Brown is the greatest wide receiver to ever play football.
At this point,
all jokes aside, he's been very good. But it stems from building. We hear it all the time, the cliche, like games are won and lost in the trenches, defensive line, offensive line. That's where the Lions have honed in on this rebuild. And it makes them competitive every week, but then sets them up for success in the future. It's been a really nice thing to see.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about it before, especially when we talk about the Bills, like how the Bills have their issues with the offensive line. And I mean, that's really as a unit, as a whole, five wide. It's rare. It's really not a thing you see around the league a lot. And that goes for defensive lines as well. But I think a lot of this is rooted with the culture and the philosophy that Dan Campbell is instilling.
Which is a real thing. Like, I hate when people act like culture and team philosophy and that is like jokey and hokey or whatever. Granted, it doesn't take hold if you're losing, but it's real and it matters. And good culture matters. And so does bad culture. They seem to have a good one there.
They sure do. And I think a lot of it is because of that philosophy of establishing physical dominance and grinding out games. And then also kind of the players buying into it. I don't know if that necessarily has to do with just the message itself or the fact that the message is coming from a lot of former NFL players.
Or that they're all scared of Dan Campbell and they're afraid that he'll just destroy them if they don't buy in.
There's a lot of former players on that coaching staff. And I think there's a little bit more validity when they speak those philosophies and they believe it and they buy into it a little bit more because they're like, oh yeah, you've been through this. You know what it takes to win. You understand what it means to grind it out and
And it's dudes who
establish
were
physicality.
successful. Aaron Glenn was a winner. Antoine Randall was a winner. Deuce Staley was
Exactly.
a winner. These were dudes who were part of either championship winning teams or teams that competed for championships. So they
Mhm.
hold value as players, exactly to your point.
And I think I really liked how you put like the juxtaposition of how you may want to start your rebuild and find a place for a quarterback to come in and
Mhm.
have it be likable compared to an uphill battle.
Yeah.
And I think it's really interesting. While obviously this is a league that's trending towards the importance of skill positions and everyone's just trying to like chomp off the bit and try and get any skill position player you can and just keep loading up on those guys. The Lions really could be sitting here gaining a competitive advantage as they expose a market inefficiency as everyone's
Mm,
going for these skill positions. They're like, no, let's build the trenches
no doubt.
and we're gonna make a situation where it's easy for that quarterback, like you said. And you also alluded to this. It's not like they don't have young skill position talent. You talked about Swift, talked about St. Brown. That they also have Hawkinson, who's, I mean, an extension of that offensive line. So they have really attractive pieces and they're doing it the right way. I don't
Mm.
know if it's necessarily going to pay off immediately. I think it is going to take that quarterback of the future. But I got to say, what they're doing right now with an above competent bridge quarterback in Jared Goff, at first, I didn't think it made a lot of sense. Like, why are you paying this guy so much? Why are you keeping him around to
Mhm.
just be mediocre? But I get it now. Like, you can really start to see the vision of what they're building from a culture standpoint and then also from a product standpoint on the field and personnel and scheme wise. All of it's really coming together holistically.
They've just put together, and you know what's funny, even with like today, like I was talking about their offensive line on Twitter, like I did last week, as I was watching that game. And Jonah Jackson and Frank Ragnow didn't even play today, and like their backups still came in, like executed well. But when healthy, you're looking at a bona fide top five line in the NFL
Easy,
with a left
easily.
tackle with Taylor Decker, left guard Jonah Jackson, Frank Ragnow, Logan Stenberg is probably like the worst, and he's still pretty good. And then you've
Mhm,
got a young year two Penei Sewell at right tackle. Decker is a top 10 tackle in this
mhm.
league. Jonah Jackson is a really strong guard. Frank Ragnow, you can easily make the case that I think he's up there with, in the conversation with Kelly and Lindsley and Mitch Morse.
Humphrey.
Yeah, Creed Humphrey, our boy, for like
Mhm.
the best centers in football.
Yeah,
Like Ragnow is a stud and he's getting paid like it. You've got this really good offensive line, which again makes you competitive week in and week out, no matter what. There
exactly.
were there were times today where,
Raises that floor. Sorry for interrupting,
oh,
but that's what it
perfect,
does. It
perfect.
raises that floor for each week in, week out.
Yes, no matter what, like you're going to have the ability to compete because your floor is raised. You're not going to get blown out. And again, that goes with what we've seen. The proof is in the pudding. You don't really see the Lions come out and just get thrashed and
No.
absolutely worked, despite the fact that in certain areas they are talent deficient
Yeah.
and that they are in year two of this rebuild. But this offensive line gives you two things. It gives you the ability to run the football, which simplifies things for your offense. But then they're also able to protect. There were times that Jared Goff today and last week against the Lions was just sitting back there with time, oodles and oodles of time. Imagine if they get a quarterback who can also create plays off script, or who's maybe a little more mobile and you have more of a dual threat piece back there, or like who has a bigger arm and they can now push the ball downfield and attack vertically with play action based off the success they have with the run. Like their rebuild again has just worked out so well. And how many times, you mentioned, granted, the Cardinals had some success with Kyler Murray, but you look at Trevor Lawrence last year, like where the Jags get the quarterback, like the chosen one quarterback,
Right.
but they don't have anything around them. And so then it's like, okay, then you come into year two and you're overspending for Christian Kirk and you're
Mhm.
overspending for Zay Jones because what do you need to do?
You literally have to.
You have to, because you have to reduce that variability because you need to figure out like, okay, like is this guy going to be our guy? Well, we gotta surround him with some B plus or A minus
Mhm.
guys so we can figure out if he's the guy or not. But it stunts the growth. It changes that development path. It starts to heat up your time that you have to let this quarterback grow and develop. And instead, again, if the Lions can get, and this is no disrespect or knock on Jared Goff, I just think we know what he is.
Mhm.
If you can get a quarterback into this offense with that offensive line and Amon-Ra St. Brown, they signed somebody to raise the floor at receiver with DJ Chark. Cool. Nice piece. You've got Swift and you've got Williams in the backfield to go with that offensive line. I don't want to say it's plug and play, but because they've raised that floor, I should say, the offensive line is still going to get better. They haven't hit their ceiling. St. Brown hasn't hit his ceiling. Neither has DeAndre Swift. And this offense already has a good baseline because of the offensive line and those two weapons. Now, if you add that quarterback who has a higher ceiling, the whole offense, their ceiling goes up, and it goes up even more for St. Brown and Swift as well. And then we look at the defensive side. Aiden Hutchinson falls into their lap at number 2. 3 sacks today. He had a monstrous day, but it's him. It's the pick of Alim McNeil last year, I would say we both really liked him last year. I like Michael Brockers. I like Charles Harris in that non-number 1 guy kind of role. Like, they're nasty. I'm going to say all these things that describes like what Dan Campbell wants. Like, they're nasty, they're physical, they're violent, they grind,
relentless, scrappy, all that stuff.
If you are the spiker in a 2-man game, you're just trying to take someone's head off. Like, that's it. Like, you're literally just trying to road grade a path for the looper. You don't want to play against a team like that always fights and always battles no matter what. And now, again, look at that, right? So we talk about these trenches. Offensive side of the ball, already genuine studs. Ragnow and Decker are studs. Sewell is borderline getting there.
Yeah, growing every day.
Yes, and with what his ceiling is stud. Aiden Hutchinson, stud. Like, as blue chip of a prospect as you can have from a motor perspective, a mental perspective, a technique perspective, he's going to get better. And then you have other supporting pieces on that defensive line. If Okuda can get back to what he potentially could have been as he starts to get healthier, Malcolm Rodriguez is a fun piece. Maybe he continues to grow. But it all starts, like we're talking about, with those trenches. They are built on the offensive line and defensive line. Everything else can grow from there. They have a solid foundation, and now it's just plugging and placing. When you have good bones for the house, it's much easier to just be like, oh, let's put in some nice windows or some nice curtains. But either way, we have a great foundation. We have a great roof. The house is insulated. It's energy efficient. The finishes will come after we've already built that solid core for the house. And that's what the Lions have. And again, we both said it. I think it's something that should be commended, how they've done this rebuild in somewhat backwards fashion that we've seen from other teams, where other teams, it's like, nope, let's get the quarterback and go from there. They were like, no, we're just going to build a really good team on both sides of the ball and then plug in the QB and we see what happens.
Come for the tree, stay for Anthony's metaphors. That's what I always say. I will say, though, the Lions may mess around and be a little bit too competitive this year and miss out on Bryce Young or CJ Stroud. I think that's like a serious, scary problem, because obviously it goes against everything that they're building in terms of the culture. You don't want to tank. You lose all validity and credibility.
And that's why built. And that's why you get Jared Goff, because you can spend all that money and waste it because you're not being competitive now. And then when you're ready to be competitive, he's gone. His money's off the books and you invest. But the problem
everywhere else.
Yes. But the problem is, oh man, and that works out even perfect. If they get a good young QB on that rookie deal and they're spending in other places and things align, that screams Super Bowl. That's what teams want to do now. Yep. That's the Mahomes model. That's that early Eagles model. That's the Buffalo Bills model. That's what you want to be and where you want to live. But yeah, like, maybe they shouldn't have gotten DJ Chark. Maybe they shouldn't have gotten Goff. Like, because again, it raises because you want to raise the floor to be competitive and establish the culture
and allow people to develop and stuff like that.
Because you want, St. Brown, for as good as he is, him progressing and developing is also tied because he gets to work with an experienced veteran quarterback in Jared Goff, who knows what he's doing. You don't want to hinder the growth of him and Swift and this offensive line, but also you don't want to win too much now. So if they can, this rebuild could be something special if they continue to lose by 3 to 5 points every week. And it's just they're on the cusp, and then they get Bryce Young or they get Stroud, or maybe they Hall from BYU and that lines up in the second round or late first or something. If they're in a position to get a quarterback while remaining competitive, we could be talking about this rebuild 2-3 years down the road as being the new model for what teams do. And I think that's why we're talking about it. Coming out of week 2, I don't know how many shows are talking about the Lions being 1-1. It's a bigger picture thing. If the Lions who are already seemingly doing this thing right, if it works out, this is what is football? It's a copycat league.
Mhm.
That's why we're seeing too high coverages and light boxes now and so on and so forth. Just like we saw all these teams trying to do cover 3 with the Legion of Boom Seattle defense. If this is how this rebuild works like it's meant to, you're going to see teams copy this model. And you'll see teams also, maybe we're already seeing a little bit. How many times in this past draft would we have seen teams reach for Malik Willis in the first round or Desmond Ridder in the early second?
Yeah, seriously.
All we saw was picking in the first, and then it was slow on quarterbacks.
Granted, it was a weak class, but you are still right.
Granted, times are different. Christian Ponder went like 12th. Jake Locker went 10th. Like, teams reach for EJ Manuel. Teams reach all the time for QBs. Maybe this turns that dial even more and swings the pendulum to that side, and teams start to change how they build based off of, hey, that worked out for that team. Let's do that. A lot of potential ramifications. So very interested in seeing what happens with these Detroit Lions